You're listening to the Eyes on Washington podcast, Holland and Knight's overarching public policy and regulation podcast series. Our public policy and regulation group has an ideal combination of lawyers and lobbyists with a comprehensive understanding of the federal policy and regulatory process. This series will shine a light on the shifting dynamics of governmental entities and the ensuing changes in economic or political policies, laws, and regulations that can have a critical impact on the health and future of your business.
Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to Holland and Knight's Eyes on Washington podcast. Today, we'll be talking about what's going on in the transportation space in the U.S., and specifically the momentum we're seeing around technology innovation, reinvigoration of the automotive industry since the Biden administration took office, and where all of this is likely to be headed. I'm Sydney Bopp, Senior Public Affairs Advisor with Holland and Knight's Public Policy and Regulations Group, where I focus on the intersection of public and private funding and financing to advance new technologies necessary for achieving deep decarbonization. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Isabel, who's also a Senior Public Affairs Advisor and focuses her practice on climate policy and emissions reductions with an emphasis on the transportation and manufacturing sectors.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here with you, Sydney.
So, Isabel, let's start off by talking about why transportation is so important right now. Where's all this interest coming from?
Sure. Thanks, Sydney. So, when we're talking about economy-wide net zero ambitions, like what we're seeing the Biden administration targeting and like what we're seeing coming out of the Democratic legislative proposals up on the Hill, the transportation sector is as important as wind and solar. There's also a huge opportunity here to boost American industry through revitalizing the automotive industry and subsequently the supply chain for components that go into cars. Historically, the U.S. has led in this space, and especially when we're talking about light-duty passenger vehicles, this is an area where American manufacturing can carve out a competitive advantage for itself, both domestically and internationally.
Overall, vehicles are an attractive area for the Biden administration and Congress to be investing political capital, because if it's done right, it's a win-win for both the environment and American business, especially across the battleground states in the Rust Belt that were so important to victories for both former President Trump and President Biden. Now, one thing I do want to note here is that when we're talking about reducing emissions from the transportation sector, not all vehicles are made equal. And we really need to look at decarbonization, not just electrification, because a one-size-fits-all approach won't get us to net zero in the timeframes that we need to meet. There are some sectors of the transportation space, mid and heavy-duty trucks, aviation, ocean-going vessels, they're really hard to electrify. The technology just isn't there right now to electrify those sectors at a commercial scale. So if we want to see emissions reductions quickly, which is really important when we're talking about climate, the U.S.'s approach needs to be broader than just electrification. We need to be able to fuel existing cars and trucks and planes with cleaner, more renewable fuel. And we need to be looking at technologies beyond just batteries and electrification. Hydrogen fuel cells, nuclear technologies, they all have applications in this broader transportation space and will eventually be part of a comprehensive solution.
So, speaking about where technology is, there's been a lot of progress in the last few years. We've seen the introduction of a lot of new passenger vehicle models from the major automakers. We've seen, this rise of companies like Tesla who are really placing climate and this transition at the forefront. It's putting it at the forefront for this industry. We also are seeing an emergence with this transition of the use of lithium-ion battery technology as kind of being the technology of choice moving forward. There's a lot of technologies that are still in development, but lithium-ion seems to be the furthest along and the most widely adopted right now. But in addition to the cars themselves and the technology inside the vehicles, we're also seeing a major transition on quote unquote fueling, right? And the move away from gasoline and petroleum-based fuels and internal combustion engines to electric powered drivetrains, whether that's for full battery powered EVs or hydrogen electric vehicles. And so what's emerged also is this question of charging stations versus an approach like battery swapping for actually powering these cars. But I think the biggest driver for this transition has also been these major commitments from the automakers. Like I said, we're already seeing the introduction of electric models from the major automakers and very aggressive targets in many cases and goals that have been set by the automakers for full transitions to electric vehicles moving forward. It's a lot of change and a lot of transition that will be required to support these major goals.
But Sydney, where do you see challenges being in meeting the targets that these automakers have set with aggressive timelines for, pretty fleet-wide electrification? What are the things that these companies need to be focused on addressing, and the federal government as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the biggest challenge that a lot of these automakers are facing right now, and the federal government is also acknowledging this as a major challenge, and we're seeing that both from announcements from the Biden administration as well as through pieces of legislation that have been introduced in Congress, is really focused on supply chain. And not only the manufacturing supply chain, but also all the way down to the materials that are going into some of the major components for these cars, specifically critical minerals and materials, rare earths, and how we're going to be able to process all of the materials that are needed to go into the batteries to support these cars and these different modes of transportation, as well as how are we going to be able to reuse and recycle and refurbish some of these materials. So I think that has emerged as one of the primary challenges in meeting this transition. And, all eyes are on it right now. And we're seeing, like I said, a lot of attention focusing on this through different executive orders. And I know, Isabel, you're going to talk about this a little bit later, but also legislation that's been introduced specifically looking at addressing this issue.
Yeah, it's a tough nut to crack. The other challenge we talk about a lot in the context of electric vehicles is infrastructure build out. We hear a lot from industry and Capitol Hill about the chicken and egg problem, where it's really hard to recruit investment into EV infrastructure without really high levels of demand for the actual EV cars. You need demand to drive supply. Conversely, it's also really hard to get consumers to choose to purchase EVs, regardless of whatever tax breaks or incentives that are available at the lot and at the time of purchase, if they aren't confident that their community, their workplace, their home have the charging infrastructure to support the purchase of. Policymakers are trying to incentivize on both sides of the equation here. Now, when we're actually talking about the EV infrastructure itself, there are three real challenges that policymakers are trying to work out in building this infrastructure. The first is cost, the second is location, and the third is ownership. Fast charging stations, the ones you put into commercial and public applications that can juice up a car in 30 minutes or less, those stations can cost upwards of $250,000 per station. That's a huge amount of upfront investment that you need to somehow finance. Which raises the second issue. Who's going to own and service this infrastructure? Is it going to be public bodies like state and local governments? It could be utilities, private automakers, especially those playing in the EV space, real estate developers, like entities that own and service parking garages, airports. There are so many different players in this space, and figuring out who's going to own and service this equipment is something that is probably going to be handled in a sort of jurisdiction and a state or local government specific way. But it is something the federal government is trying to make sure that they're incentivizing the right way. And the third issue, where are these charging stations going to be located? There's talk of developing national corridors along major interstates and traffic corridors that are highly electrified to support these fast charging stations. Or do we put them in environmental justice communities where people will benefit the most from investment in emissions reductions? These are the three main questions being contemplated by Congress and the administration as we're talking about infrastructure and the build out of stations and what you need to support a national network of EVs.
So, Isabel, that's a great segue into what the federal government can be doing. Congress and the actions that Congress is going to take remains uncertain. And I know, like I said, you're going to touch on this a little bit later, but even without congressional action, a lot can be done. And as I mentioned before, what we're already seeing from the Biden administration, I believe we'll continue to see, is a whole of government approach to solving these big challenges that have aggressive timelines. And this transition for transportation electrification and transition to EVs is a great example of that. We've already seen from the Biden administration several executive orders that are aimed at addressing this challenge, an issue for meeting this transition in a timely manner. One touches on federal procurement of electric vehicles for the federal government. And then the other is Executive Order 14017, which speaks more specifically to supply chain and supply chain for batteries. In response to the supply chain executive order, we have already seen from several federal agencies, including the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense, requests for information from industry, academia, kind of you name it, folks who are working on this issue every day to provide additional insight into what these challenges really are, suggestions about how some of these shortcomings may be approached by the federal government. And so there is an opportunity for that public-private discussion on how to go about addressing some of these issues. And I think that will continue. But right now, step one was putting out the executive orders. Step two is the agencies putting out these RFIs to collect the information from industry to inform future reports and decision making on how to address these issues. And so this will just continue over the next several months and probably likely year or two of the Biden administration. We're also seeing continued activity from agencies like the U.S. Department of Energy in investing in technology development, advanced manufacturing, supply chain. Again, there's a new program for critical materials in the Office of Fossil Energy at DOE, and also interagency work between agencies like the Department of Energy, Transportation, Interior, GSA, etc., for this broader infrastructure and EV charging infrastructure piece. So there's a lot that's going on. But, and a lot in technology development that will continue. I think there'll be more that we'll see out of these agencies. But Isabel, I'm going to turn it back to you to get your thoughts on not only what we're seeing from the White House and DOD and energy, but also to hear your thoughts about the roles of the Transportation Department and EPA in this transition as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sydney. The DOE and Commerce Department and White House, their roles are mostly about incentivizing technology development, incentivizing procurement, creating those markets, creating the technology, making sure that they end up there. DOT and EPA play a different role. They're mostly going to be on the planning and regulatory side of the EV equation. But it's an important piece of the equation and not something to overlook from the perspective. Many companies are really focused on funding and focused on, getting resources out of the federal government. But you also need to be thinking about defensive and in some cases offensive opportunities with the DOT and EPA. So DOT plays a big role in infrastructure investment and planning. How do resources become allocated to
these different, state and local government initiatives. They have things like the Smart City Initiative, which is about long-term planning for urban areas that incorporates not just things like EVs, but also autonomous vehicles and connectivity. So those are things that the DOT plays a big role in from a planning perspective. NHTSA also is a big part of the equation here too, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They're the ones that set standards for vehicles and safety standards associated with vehicle design. So they're, as cars are electrified and as vehicle design changes, again, including not just alternative advanced propulsion mechanisms, but also autonomous components, vehicle design is changing. And so they are playing a big role in making sure that safety is still, is something that we can address in some of these new vehicle designs, in addition to the tailpipe emissions benefits and also the overall emissions profile of these new vehicles.
So DOT and NHTSA also work with EPA on fuel economy standards. These are the corporate average fuel economy or CAFE standards for vehicles. Regulation on automakers through these standards will help to drive the transition to EVs, because the higher the standards are set, the more automakers must incorporate hybrids, electric vehicles into their offerings to be able to meet those higher standards. So they will essentially drive a faster transition the higher they are set. Now, the Biden administration is in the process of promulgating new regulations to replace the standards for light-duty vehicles model years 21 to 26. These new regulations are being designed to replace the Trump-era standards that were established in a very controversial rule known as the Safe Vehicles Rule, which in turn replaced standards developed under President Obama. And those standards were considered a major part of his environmental legacy. So the Safe Vehicles Rule was particularly controversial in replacing those standards. And this new regulation that the Biden administration is anticipated to put out will be the third iteration of the standards and are actually expected to be the most aggressive. And they will be for the current model years, 2021 to 2026. We're also likely to see additional ones for 2027 on.
As you can tell from the constant updating, there really hasn't been a lot of certainty in this space, and that's something that's frustrated automakers. They're in the business; they're creating model designs 10 years in advance, and so the lack of certainty around these standards has been a frustration in terms of their long-term planning as they're envisioning these new advanced propulsion mechanisms. So a number of these automakers actually went directly to strike a deal with California to voluntarily meet more aggressive standards back in 2019 after the Trump administration rolled out their standards. So the next iteration of the federal standards are likely to build on the voluntary agreement here. And there are a number of different court cases that we need to be paying attention to in this space, but it's something to consider from a regulatory perspective. The number that they set these emission standards at, in order to meet these standards, the automakers are going to need to have a certain amount EV in their portfolio to meet very aggressive corporate average fuel economy standards. So it's something to keep an eye on as well from the regulatory perspective.
Great. So Isabel, all of that insight on the role of the Transportation Department, EPA, what's happening at the states, so relevant. Then we also have the legislative branch of the federal government. So can you talk about what Congress is looking at right now in terms of transportation and more specifically elements that touch on transportation, electrification, and deep decarbonization?
Absolutely, Sydney. Big picture, transportation is a big focus for Congress right now, especially congressional Democrats. As I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, transportation accounts for a third of the emissions profile in terms of the U.S.'s carbon footprint. So it's something that all committees are thinking about and taking into consideration, particularly in the House Energy and Commerce, leading on this. The House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis is really looking at this. While they don't have any legislative jurisdiction, they're certainly in the business of developing proposals that can be sent to the other committees of jurisdiction, as well as the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, a few other folks. On the Senate side, you've got the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee leading on some of these transportation, electrification issues. You also have the Senate Energy on Natural Resources playing, and you also are looking at tax incentives. So you have the tax committees playing this space as well. So there are a lot of different legislative bodies within Congress, both the House and Senate, that are focused on EVs and where they can use their jurisdiction to build a future for these vehicles and for electrification of the passenger vehicle sector. So big picture, I'll just sort of lay the sort of vehicles out that may move this year with the note that everything is up in the air until it happens when it comes to Congress. So this is all speculation, but there is potential for a couple of different pieces to move on EVs that I think people should be aware of. Number one, and the most certain, is going to be the federal budget for fiscal year 2022. So funding is set to expire for the federal government this year on September 30th. And Congress needs to pass its annual appropriations for the federal government by that date, or pass some sort of extension and, pass the final bill by the end of the year, which is typically what they do. Now, there's a lot of programmatic funding that go to existing government programs to watch in these bills. There may be a lot of language that designates an average amount of funding to some of these programs, but specifically says a carve out from this program must go to support EVs or EV infrastructure. So there's something to be looked at, not just in the top line numbers that come out of these budgets, but the way that the congressional committees are writing their reports to direct the usage of this funding. Also in the mix, earmarks are back. Community project funding, as it's known this year, are small pots of money that individual members of Congress secure for their districts. And it's very possible that some Democrats try to get funding directed to their constituents for things like infrastructure build out for EVs. So it's something to keep an eye on as well. And from an individual, like local government or state perspective, that's a huge opportunity for build out to support EVs and electrification. So that's sort of bucket number one. Slightly less certain, bucket number two is the potential for an infrastructure package. There are two routes that can be taken for this package. One is bipartisan, and the other could pass with just Democratic votes. So one is going to be something that moves with the support of Republicans and Democrats, and the other, through a process known as budget reconciliation, could move without any Republican support, theoretically. Now, that's a high bar, especially when we're talking about EVs, because while there's a lot of interest in electrification, it's still a pretty partisan issue on Capitol Hill. Republicans are careful about allocating funding to specific technologies. I think that generally, philosophically, they sort of like to take a more technology neutral approach. And some Democrats are interested in that as well. So spending a lot of government resources on build out to support one specific technology, something that it's going to be hard to get a lot of bipartisan support for that. That said, there is a ton of Democratic interest in this based on just the opportunity for emissions reduction. So you do have, sort of a back and forth on this, and especially in the context of infrastructure. So if a transportation package moves in a bipartisan way, it's probably going to be tied to reauthorization for surface transportation programs. So all of the DOT's programs are authorized through a usually sort of mid to long-term bill that's passed every couple of years. These programs are set to expire on September 30th this year. So barring some kind of extension, there's going to have to be a package to address DOT's programs on surface transportation, and that includes, highway programs, a lot of like city funding for transportation and transit issues. So it's typically the advancement of that bill would move in a bipartisan way, especially through the Senate. So there's certainly going to be attention paid to that. And there are a number of different proposals that could hitch a ride on that theoretically. Now, if those negotiations don't go well, Democrats may try to move a bill without those Republican votes. And there are a couple of Democratic proposals out there of different levels of sort of aggressiveness, I'm going to say. And those proposals may work their way into at least the House's version of a partisan infrastructure bill. Those include the Clean Future Act, the Moving Forward Act that was introduced the last Congress, and we're probably going to have reintroduced pretty soon here on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee side. There's also discussion of including a tax title in this bill. And there are a couple of different tax credits that are really important for electrification. Number one is the tax credit that can be used to actually install EV infrastructure. There's discussion of raising. Currently, the credit is capped at $30,000 per station. That doesn't go as far as it needs to for high intensity charging stations, the ones that I mentioned earlier that can cost upwards of $250,000 a head. That $30,000 incentive just really doesn't get it. So there's discussion about trying to increase the value of that credit and a few other amendments there. There are also credits that are offered to individuals who purchase EVs. So again, you're sort of addressing the supply and you're also addressing the demand. Right now, there are limits on how many of those credits can be offered to people who buy EVs per automaker. So each automaker is allotted a certain number of credits that they can give, basically. And this is something that there's a lot of Democratic interest in expanding or extending. So there are a couple of different tax pieces here that could go into an infrastructure bill, and certainly a lot of Democratic interest in. I'm going to stop there. There are a couple of other bills on the horizon that I'm happy to talk to at a different podcast, but I'm going to stop there as I don't want to drone on here. But the top line takeaway is that there are a lot of things moving in Congress right now, and ultimately it's a good time to get plugged in.
Love the puns. Thanks, Isabel. There is a lot that's happening right now, and a lot that has yet to be introduced in Congress. There's a lot of work that's happening within all of these agencies. And, it's just a really exciting time for folks who are involved in this industry, tracking it and part of this bigger transition. So I think from everything we've shared through our discussion today and this conversation, what my biggest takeaway is that this transition is happening. Even without congressional action, we're seeing so much occur, driven by private industry. There's so much that federal agencies can already do with existing authority. And, having certainty with either extension or expansion and revision of existing tax credits and programs does provide that additional certainty to industry that enables them to plan for the future. But I think, plans are being made anyway. So, with that, it's an exciting time. It is a good time to get engaged. You're not already. And I think, Isabel, I just want to thank you for joining me in this conversation today. And I want to thank everyone who has tuned in for listening to our conversation. If you're interested in learning more, please feel free to reach out to either Isabel or myself. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Sydney.
Thank you for listening to the Eyes on Washington podcast, brought to you by Holland and Knight's Public Policy and Regulation Group. For more information on our Public Policy and Regulation Group, please visit hklaw.com/ppr.